It began on an unremarkable day in the southern Tunisian city of Sfax. The story I'm about to share has lingered in the shadows of this region for more than 2 decades. A tale so eerie that it's spoken of in hushed tones, like a cautionary secret. My mother recounted this unsettling story to me not long ago, and it has clung to my thoughts ever since. It centers around a woman named Amber, notorious throughout the city for her sinister practice of black magic. Amber was no ordinary woman. Her name was spoken in hushed tones, with fear and disdain. She had spent her entire life weaving curses and casting spells, leaving a trail of destruction in her wake. She tore families apart, cursed people into lifelong illnesses, stripped others of their wealth, and inflicted suffering wherever she went. It was said she reveled in misery, thriving on the power her sorcery gave her. But no one escapes the grip of death, not even Amber. After years of committing unspeakable acts, she passed away. Her death sent a ripple of unease through the community, but it wasn't until her daughters prepared her body for burial that the true horror began. The daughters, following tradition, brought their mother's body for the ritual washing before burial. Amber had always been fair-skinned in life, but what they saw after the cleansing left them paralyzed with fear. Her complexion had darkened dramatically. Her once pale skin was now a deep, almost pitch-black shade. The sight was so grotesque, so unnatural, that the daughters broke down, wailing and clutching their mother's lifeless body in despair. Tears streamed down their faces as they begged God for mercy. They knew the truth. They had always known. In Islam, it's believed that a righteous life leaves a person's face radiant and serene in death, but those who live in sin bear its mark, even in the grave. Amber's transformation was undeniable proof of her dark deeds, and her daughters, desperate to save their mother's soul, pleaded for her sins to be forgiven. The ritual continued, and it came time to wrap her body in the burial shroud. As the men carried Amber's corpse to her final resting place, they experienced something deeply unsettling. Her body, they said, grew heavier with every step. What started as a manageable weight soon became almost impossible to bear, as though an unseen force was holding her back. They staggered forward, beads of sweat forming on their brows, each step more grueling than the last. The witnesses knew this was no ordinary struggle. They whispered among themselves, certain that Amber's resistance to her burial was a manifestation of her tormented soul. The men carrying her could feel it, the weight of her sins pressing down on them. Her spirit refusing to go to the grave, unwilling to face what awaited her on the other side. The men pressed forward with grim determination, dragging Amber's lifeless body toward the waiting grave. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if an invisible force was weighing them down, testing their resolve. The oppressive silence of the cemetery only added to the growing sense of unease, broken occasionally by the shuffling of feet and labored breaths. By the time they reached the gravesite, their faces were slick with sweat, their muscles strained from the unnatural weight of the body. 2 cemetery workers stepped forward, gripping their shovels tightly, and began digging into the dry, unyielding earth. The sound of metal biting into soil echoed eerily in the still air, each scrape a reminder of the task at hand. But as the minutes turned into hours, a chilling realization began to dawn. No matter how deep the workers dug, something felt profoundly wrong. Every time they attempted to lower the body into the grave, an invisible force seemed to resist their efforts. It was as though the earth itself was rejecting her, pushing back with an unseen but undeniable power. They dug deeper, their frustration mounting with every failed attempt, and yet, no matter how much they widened or deepened the grave, the body refused to settle. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their once steady movements now faltering as sweat poured down their faces. The oppressive weight of the situation bore down on everyone present, filling the air with an unspoken dread. Amid the growing tension, the imam stepped forward, his presence a steadying force against the chaos. He began reciting prayers, his voice calm yet firm, rising above the murmurs of the crowd. Each verse echoed across the cemetery, a beacon of faith against the encroaching darkness. The crowd fell silent, their unease momentarily held at bay by the imam's unwavering conviction. He continued, his words filling the air with a solemn determination that seemed to challenge whatever force was resisting the burial. After what felt like an eternity, the body was finally forced into the grave. The moment was fraught with tension, the air thick with fear, as the final shovelfuls of earth were hastily thrown over the body. As the burial was completed, the workers stepped back, their faces pale with exhaustion and unease. The crowd began to disperse, their movements slow and hesitant, as though the cemetery itself was reluctant to let them go. The men walked toward the gate in uneasy silence, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. Just as they neared the exit, the night was shattered by an unsplitting explosion. The deafening sound ripped through the stillness, reverberating across the cemetery like a thunderclap. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the air was filled with a sudden, terrifying energy. The men froze in place, their breath caught in their throats, as the chilling reality set in. Whatever dark force had resisted Ember's burial was far from gone. Spinning around, their eyes widened in horror as flames erupted from Amber's grave. Smoke billowed into the night, the acrid stench of burning filling the air. The men froze in terror, their minds struggling to comprehend what they were witnessing. The flames licked the night sky and the men began to shout, their voices rising in frantic prayers for protection. God save us! God protect us! Panic gripped the group, but the imam held his ground. His voice rang out above the chaos as he began reciting verses from the Quran with renewed urgency. The others joined in, their trembling voices weaving together in a desperate plea for divine intervention. He held a white cloth to his lips, exposing the weapons engraved on it, marked with the following words. Meanwhile, some of the men ran to fetch water to extinguish the fire. Buckets were hurriedly passed, their contents splashing against the inferno. Hours passed in this chaotic struggle until finally the flames were subdued. Silence descended once more, but the damage was done. Meanwhile, the jail was unsealed. The gates were locked. As the smoke cleared, the scorched remains of Amber's body lay exposed. Her flesh was charred, her features unrecognizable. The sight left everyone shaken, but the imam stood firm. He made a grim decision. "We cannot leave her here," he said. "This is not over." With great care, the workers lifted what was left of Amber's body from the grave and transported it back to the morgue. The imam instructed the morgue staff to hold the body for a few days. "We will try again," he said. "Inshallah, we will conduct the burial properly next time." But as the men departed that night, a single thought haunted them all. Was this woman so steeped in evil that even the earth itself refused to accept her? A few days later, the imam returned to the cemetery, this time with the same men who had witnessed the horrors of the first burial. The tension was palpable. No one spoke of it openly, but the question lingered in their minds. Would the events of that terrifying day repeat themselves? Determined to ensure a proper burial, the imam began reciting verses from the Quran with unwavering focus. But this time, the burial was uneventful. The body, which had once resisted with an almost supernatural force, was now lowered into the grave without incident. The dirt was shoveled over it, sealing Amber's remains beneath the earth. There were no explosions, No flames, no unnatural resistance, just silence. The men, still wary, waited for a few moments before leaving. When nothing happened, they finally exhaled, relief washing over them like a wave. And with that, they left the cemetery, finally free of the weight of her sinister legacy. For decades, it has been whispered from one generation to the next, serving as a grim warning about the dangers of embracing a path steeped in darkness. The chilling details and the sequence of events that unfolded are etched into the memories of all who hear them. It's a stark reminder that some choices come with unimaginable consequences, and the echoes of such tales linger far longer than the moments they describe. And, moral of the story is, beware of tampering with dark forces. Some powers are best left undisturbed.